We did it. I got some honey mustard on my computer earlier. Sorry about that. No, because I really like the waffle fries at the Red Line.
Oh,
So I got some of those this afternoon. Yeah. I
yummy.
went a little overboard a few minutes ago. Oh, wait a minute. By the way, hi, everybody.
Hi, everybody.
Good evening, friends. I bet we could just do a 2-hour show just devoted to food, and that would be okay.
That would be delicious. You know, one of my favorite YouTubers actually recently, he's a pop music critic, and he recently just randomly did a top 10 countdown of the best buses of the 1990s.
Oh, really?
Yeah, and it was amazing. So, nothing wrong with having a random video thrown in there once a decade or so. Like, hey, you know what? Compared to my usual content.
It's been 12 and a half years. I might be due to just completely go off the rails with a couple of completely random things, you know?
Yeah, you should do one on cheese.
Yeah, gee, I don't know why you would make that suggestion. That's a good one.
Yep.
That is one thing that I've added to my bucket list if I ever go to England,
Yeah.
is to go to James May's pub.
Ooh.
Yep.
Where in England is it?
It's in the south. It's like, if you know where Southampton and Bristol are,
Yeah.
it's kind of in between those two.
Nice.
Okay. Well, hi there. Good evening, and welcome to a new webinar presentation on the Roadway Wiz YouTube channel. Great to have you with us. I'm your dear and fearless host, Roadway Wiz. We've got a very interesting panel for you tonight as we discuss a very interesting city. In fact, it's so interesting I only have one other person doing this show with me tonight, which is a little unusual, I guess. But she is a longtime friend of the channel, longtime contributor to our live shows over the last 3 years. You know her very well. You know her as Mrs. MD Rhodes, perhaps. She is Laura on the AARoads forum. Laura Bianca Pruitt, everybody.
Yay! Thank you so much for having me once again, Dan. I really love being on your channel and doing these webinars with you.
They are fun every once in a while, aren't they?
Yeah.
And it's great to have you, because I know that this is one city that you and I kind of circled very early on when we were going through the different possibilities of cities that we could do this winter. And this is certainly one that I kind of zeroed in on. And I kind of figured that you would be interested in it as well. And yeah, we both kind of took to it, and we came up with a PowerPoint that I think you guys are going to enjoy. So glad to have you with us.
Yeah. And as usual, I have, 4 million pages of notes that I have to condense down into like a few minutes.
Yeah, well, I think I told you 5 to 7 minutes or something like that.
Yeah.
So I'm going to time you, and then we'll see how well you actually do, okay?
Okay.
Yeah. All right, so Birmingham, Alabama is a city that I think doesn't really get a lot of attention in general. Certainly when you compare it against its more popular neighbors, such as Atlanta to the east and Nashville to the north, and even other cities like Memphis and New Orleans. Birmingham is a city that's very much overshadowed by other major cities in the Deep South, and we're gonna do something a little different on this show tonight. We're gonna talk about the freeways, of course, but there's also a lot of other stuff that was going on historically in the city in the mid 20th century that deserves a lot of attention here. A lot of which played a significant role in the development of the city in the latter half of the 20th century, and also it had a lot to do with how the city's freeway system even came to be in the first place. So we'll get into that. We will deal with all of that in due course. What on earth am I doing on YouTube these days? Well, I started uploading some Oklahoma content finally, and I think for the next couple of weeks you're going to see a lot of Interstate 35 coverage between Minneapolis and Oklahoma City. I've already started a significant amount of that, and there's probably another 10 days worth of that still to go. So I'm just uploading everything that I have of that interstate, whether it's rural, urban. I just want to get it all out there. So that's my current project for the next 10 days. After that, we'll return to some more Oklahoma stuff, and we'll kind of talk about that in the next couple of weeks. Gribble Nation, Doug is at it again, updating pages. I think he's got more covered bridges that he's profiling. So there's new articles coming out on a pretty frequent basis now. This is his uploading season, so he's getting a lot of that done. Tom is continuing to work on some stuff that's California-based. So he's always got something interesting to say about California, especially the old U.S. highway system. And I'd really like to get back into doing some blogging and podcasting as well in the next couple of months. So we'll see what I can start to put together in those realms in the near future. We will talk about Season 4 in just a moment, but before I forget, I would like to give my friends down on the Gulf Coast, Jason and Carrie, the co-creators of the 504 Road Trips YouTube channel, a big round of applause this evening as their channel surpassed the 10,000 subscribers mark this week. So Yay! So congratulations to them. I actually need to talk to Jason because he and I, back in January last time I was down south, we did some video work together. And you see what our setup was in the car on the upper right picture here. You can see my camera in the lower left, and you see his camera in the upper right. We were fighting for space in the car, and I think we made it work between the two of us. So there's some stuff in coastal Alabama that we documented, and we might do some sort of a joint video together on this from this drive. We actually have to talk about the specifics of it still, but that is something that we might release to the public in the next couple of months, so be on the lookout for that. It's hard to believe that we are starting our 4th winter season. Where the hell does the time go? I have no idea. But here we are.
Yeah, talk about time going. Season 4, and now the littlest road geek in our community is about to turn 3.5.
Yeah, she is, which is crazy.
Yes.
I remember when she was this wee little thing when she just came home from the hospital.
Yeah.
Aww. And I could hold her, and she was a little limbless mutant, and now she's like 3.5 years old, and she's like causing trouble all over the place.
Right, which is why you probably won't hear her on the call tonight. I mean, unless Mike brings her back early or something. If I go over my 5 to 7 minute limit.
Yeah, right. Yeah, so that's one way to put it in perspective for sure. Yeah. I've been doing YouTube now for 12.5 years, and I've been doing these live shows for probably about 3.5 years. I've learned a couple of things along the way that that never really occurred to me. One of them is that anybody can do YouTube poorly. And then once you start it and once you get into it, you discover that there's a very fine line between bluffing your way through and actually doing good content. And over those last 3 years, I've learned that sitting here in front of a microphone and opening my mouth and saying words in and of itself is not difficult. But doing so in a meaningful way, that's pretty tough. And it's a lot harder to pull off than you might think.
I would agree with that.
And so it's something that I wasn't really good at when I started. I mean, if you go back and listen to the first few shows that I did, I mean, they were just terrible. But, you know, I've gradually forged an identity for myself, and I've worked at it, and now I'm at the point where they're not bad. You know? So
I think we've gotten a lot better as time has gone on. I like to think that each season, each episode just gets better and better.
I think so. I think that there's a camaraderie and a brotherhood that we all have, and that, you know, as we get more and more comfortable with this idea of doing live shows, we become more comfortable with, you know, talking to an audience, and we get more comfortable dealing with each other. And,
yeah.
And I do see that growth that we've seen over the last 3 years, certainly. So it's been really cool to kind of see us grow as presenters as well.
Indeed.
But I would just like to say before we kick off that whether you're watching us this evening from Philadelphia or you're in the Philippines or somewhere in between, thank you all very much for being a part of this journey of ours. And we hope you'll stick around through this coming winter for whatever comes our way along the way. All right, I'm going to get off my podium here because you guys want to talk about Birmingham tonight. Okay. Let's do this. Birmingham's nickname is the Magic City, and that originates from its extremely rapid growth at the end of the 19th and early 20th centuries. You wouldn't necessarily know that today when you look at the city's metrics. The city's population is about 200,000. The metro population is just over 1 million. The city's population is down almost 50% from what it was in the early 1960s, which is when it was roughly at its peak. The city was incorporated in 1871, and the early founders of the city named the settlement for the city Birmingham in England. And interestingly, much like Birmingham, England, Birmingham, Alabama became an industrial center centered around the railroad and steel industries. And so for that reason, it very quickly caught on as a national hub of industrial activity in the years immediately after the Civil War. And became known also as the Pittsburgh of the South. The other thing that Birmingham had going for it at that time was the abundant presence of natural resources such as coal, limestone, and iron ore. Kind of unusual to find all three of them, you know, in close proximity to each other, but Birmingham was in an advantageous place to take advantage of all three. And there were mines all across this part of Alabama throughout the 19th and well into the 20th century. Nowadays, economically, it's shifted away from those industries. It's more of a healthcare and higher education hub. The University of Alabama is a major partner with the state of Alabama in general, but also the Birmingham area. There's the University of Alabama Birmingham campus, which is right downtown. And there's some other things as well that we'll talk about that's, you know, university related. The one other thing that I will tease you with at this point is that, like I said at the top, Birmingham was a hub of a lot of things that were going on in, say, the 1950s and 60s related to the civil rights movement. And a lot of the things that were going on there helped sort of direct the path of the city through the remaining years of the 20th century. And we'll get into that in just a moment. But before we do that, I would like to just, as we traditionally do on these shows, we try to have some fun doing so. Let's talk pro sports in the city that we are talking about this evening. The University of Alabama is, the king in the Birmingham area. Probably the single biggest rivalry in the state is the rivalry that U of Alabama has with Auburn, which is located further south. It's off of I-85 in far eastern Alabama. The game that they play against each other every year is known as the Iron Bowl, and it's quite often considered one of the fiercer, more competitive games in college football on an annual basis. NASCAR is king as well in Alabama. Talladega Superspeedway is located off of Interstate 20 between Birmingham and Atlanta, and that draws big crowds twice a year to those races out that way. The Birmingham Barons are the baseball team in town. They are the AA affiliate of the Chicago White Sox. You might have heard of them because of this certain gentleman here in the lower left, some guy named Michael Jordan. He played for the Birmingham Barons in 1994. Remember how he retired the first time and then went to play baseball? Well, he played for the Barons for about a year before he said, enough of this, I want back into the NBA.
Hey, speaking of that, remember how I teased about my friend in the top 10 buses of the 90s?
Yes.
One of the buses on that list is the Birmingham Barons bus that Michael Jordan bought for the team when he was on it.
Oh, really?
Yes.
Nice.
Yes.
Okay.
It's a pretty sweet bus.
If he bought it, I'm sure it was.
Oh, yeah.
Birmingham has never had an NFL team. The proximity of the big Alabama SEC schools kind of prohibits any pro team from really taking hold in this part of the country. They have had professional teams in other leagues. Starting in the mid-1980s with the USFL, the Birmingham Stallions played for, I think they were only around for about a year before the whole USFL thing fell apart in the mid-80s. But in the new reboot of the USFL in 2022, Birmingham was granted one of the 8 franchises, and they rebooted the Stallions franchise for the new USFL. In fact, after their first season, they are the defending league champions in the USFL, for whatever that may be worth. The XFL, yeah, everybody loves the XFL. The 2001 iteration of that league featured a team in Birmingham. They were known as the Birmingham Thunderbolts. We're going to talk about this more in a couple of minutes, but they actually had to change their name because they were originally going to be called the Birmingham Blast, which a lot of people thought was tasteless due to some of the recent history in the city of Birmingham, which I'm sure Laura's got some stuff to tell us about.
Oh, do I?
So they said, well, the Blast probably is not a very good name. So they renamed themselves the Thunderbolts. Either way, the XFL of 2001 folded after 1 year. When the XFL rebooted, they did not include provision for a franchise in Birmingham. Now, one other league that we should mention is the Alliance of American Football, also known as the AF. That's what I call them. They didn't even make it through their inaugural season before filing for bankruptcy, but they too had a franchise in Birmingham called the Birmingham Iron. So, pro football in Birmingham, chances are it's going to be short-lived, no matter what league it's in. But there is, I guess it's somewhat interesting, right?
Who needs pro football when you have Roll Tide?
Well, that's kind of what I said earlier. You know, it kind of all comes back to them, right?
Yeah.
Yeah. Speaking of Roll Tide, this bridge in the upper left picture is part of an interchange along I-20 in Tuscaloosa. They were still working on this interchange when I was through here, and they were still finishing up the bridge. You can, I don't know, it's kind of hard to see in this picture, but you can see the temporary supports underneath. Some of the stuff that they got there holding it up. That is now a spooey interchange, I believe. There's additional ramps that were built in the foreground of this picture. That's probably the most interesting bridge in all of central Alabama, at least that I came across. There's not a whole lot to speak of here. Birmingham has a modest skyline. In fact, in the early years of its rapid growth at the end of the 19th and early 20th century, it had some of the first high-rise buildings in the Deep South. But today it's kind of got... It's not a particularly memorable skyline, but there are a few buildings in here that might pique your interest. One of the other things that I mentioned earlier was the prominence of the steel industry in Birmingham. And one of the really interesting tourist sites that I recommend you check out is a place called the Sloss Furnaces, which is located just east of downtown. It is the site of a former steel mill, and it's actually open to tours. So you can go visit and kind of go back in time to see what the steelmaking process was like, you know, from the mining of the iron ore to the production of the steel to the shipping out on the railroads. This is a really neat spot to come and visit if you're into that kind of thing and if you have the time. So definitely recommend that. Okay, well, I'm going to... What do you think, Laura? Should I turn it over to you now?
Let's do it.
All right. Laura's going to talk for a few minutes about what I've been alluding to for a while here, and that is the how Birmingham fits into the civil rights movement and how that fits into the development of the city's freeway system. So, Laura, the floor is yours.
All right. So when we first think of civil rights in Birmingham, you know, I think we all have a few pictures that come to mind, right? We think of the Birmingham Campaign, which was also known as Project C, the C being for confrontation. We think of Dr. Martin Luther King Jr.'s letter from Birmingham Jail. Unfortunately, we think of there being bombings, with the most, tragic being the 16th Street Baptist Church bombing that killed 4 young girls in 1963. We also think of the Freedom Rides and how the first one Birmingham played a key role in. So Birmingham is important because what happened there is what ultimately led to, the passage of the Civil Rights Act of 1964 and the Selma to Montgomery March, which we covered in a previous episode. But, first it should be known that Birmingham, was known as one of the most segregated cities in the country. There was a zoning law that was passed in 1926 that established land use districts and racial boundaries where Black residents were allowed to live, which were few and far between. So by the mid-1940s, Black neighborhoods could no longer accommodate the growing population. So Black residents started moving into white neighborhoods. And then in 1950, a federal appeals court struck down the zoning law. But, there was a massive resistance to any form of integration. And at the same time, urban renewal started to be used to destroy neighborhoods. And a key player in, this massive resistance to integration was Public Safety Commissioner Eugene Bull Connor. Basically, I guess the two big key players are Reverend Fred Shuttleworth of the Bethel Baptist Church, which is located in Collegeville in North Birmingham, and Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. So the NAACP was outlawed in 1956. So Reverend Shuttleworth started the Alabama Christian Movement for Human Rights, and he was also one of the founders with Dr. King for the Southern Christian Leadership Conference in 1957. So ultimately, their goals over several years were nonviolent protests to end bus segregation, for the city to hire Black police officers, or they had organized sit-ins against segregated lunch counters. And they had very serious threats to their lives. Their houses and places of worship were bombed. I mean, it just blows my mind that, the parsonage of Bethel Baptist Church was first bombed on Christmas Day, 1956. And their houses and neighborhoods are bombed. A key neighborhood that'll come up later is Smithfield. Because when, we've talked about in a lot of other episodes about how highways have played a role in the sense that where a lot of highways were planned based on redlining and slum clearance and urban renewal, but Birmingham took that to the extreme. That basically a lot of where these freeways were planned was very much retaliation against, neighborhoods and the people involved in the civil rights movement. I already mentioned about the 16th Street Baptist Church bombing, which happened Sunday, September 15, 1963, when 4 KKK members planted 19.6 of dynamite beneath the steps of the church. It's just very sad. But yeah, so, and again, I'll go into a little more detail later about how, in particular, the highway, I already kind of talked about this, that the highways were built also to enforce a wall of separation between the neighborhoods. Basically, the ones that it didn't go through, it was there to reinforce the original 1926 zoning lines that were now considered, unconstitutional. That the roads were used as a way to reinforce those lines.
It's kind of a way to wall off, those neighborhoods from the other, the white, the more affluent neighborhoods too, right? Wasn't that a tactic, in terms of building a wall? We'll just build a freeway between the two of them,
That was exactly what it was.
Yeah.
I guess moving on a little bit to the other, key things that mentioned the Freedom Rides in 1961. Basically, they were buses full of activists who rode throughout the southern U.S. in order to integrate interstate bus lines. The first Freedom Ride left D.C. on May 4th, 1961, and it was scheduled to arrive in New Orleans on May 17th. But by the time it got to Birmingham, there was a ton of mob violence. The bus, the bus was burned. And basically, when these reports reached U.S. Attorney General Robert F. Kennedy, he sent his assistant to try and calm the situation. He arranged for an escort for the riders to continue to Montgomery, but the Greyhound drivers refused. So ultimately, the activists had to fly the rest of the way. But there were 60 different rides and 436 different people involved. And it ultimately resulted in a desegregation order from the Interstate Commerce Commission. And so the Birmingham campaign was in 1963 in April and May. And that was a series of sit-ins and marches that were intended to provoke mass arrests and overload the jails. They didn't have enough adult volunteers, so they trained students. And basically, they walked 50 at a time from 16th Street Baptist Church to City Hall to try and negotiate with the mayor. And this resulted in over 1,000 arrests. And the Birmingham Police Department and Bull Connor attacked the nonviolent demonstrators with high-pressure water hoses and with dogs. And those images spread across the country and brought a lot of sympathy to the movement. Business owners were turned against Bull Connor because he was ultimately then doing economic damage to their businesses because then nobody wanted to come to Birmingham. So, and during these arrests, one of the people arrested was Dr. King. And so that's where, he wrote his letter from Birmingham Jail. In summary, and I'll actually read a little bit more. I'll read some key quotes at the very, very end if you want to hang around at the very, very end of the video. But basically, in summary, in a few sentence summary. The letter says that people have a moral responsibility to break unjust laws and to take direct action rather than waiting potentially forever for justice to come through the courts. And it's this letter where you get the quote, "Injustice anywhere is a threat to justice everywhere." And he brought up about how they previously tried to negotiate with politicians and business leaders prior to these protests, but were instead left with a lot of broken promises. He also expressed disappointment in white Christians and white moderates who stayed silent and maintained the status quo rather than fight for justice. Those words, status quo, that will come up again later. Very important. Rather than fight for justice, and the disappointment that people are more upset with protests rather than the deplorable conditions people are protesting against. So Birmingham, you know, it wasn't just a crossroads. It was like this campaign, everything that happened, this was like the big thing that ultimately, you know, ousted Connor from his job, brought King, you know, upped his reputation, forced desegregation in Birmingham. And again, what I'll do is when we get to the specific highways, and it's not all the highways, it's 3 in particular, but I'll talk more about each highway as we get there. But I think now my end, I cannot, for some reason, the slides are not refreshing for me. So I don't know if you're on the slide yet with the map, Dan.
Well, I just moved there a few seconds ago. It should show up on your screen.
Okay, great. Well, so I'll give you a teaser. So as you can see, there's 2 maps here. There's the one, and both of these are from this incredible paper. And the author's name has just slipped me. The author's amazing. He actually emailed me the paper. We've been in correspondence. His name is Dr. Charles Conley, and he did this research back in 2002 on racial zoning and highways in Birmingham. But these are figures from his paper. And basically the figure on the left, it shows the areas that are zoned for that were zoned for black households in Birmingham in 1926. And then it shows the highways. And as you can see, a lot of the highways go right smack next to or right through neighborhoods. And I think it's very important to point out that if you look at the map on the right, how straight the lines are, relatively speaking, compared to the map on the left, that was not an accident. That was very intentional. That alignments were chose to make I-59 and I-65 windier in order to intentionally create a wall and or put the roads straight through neighborhoods.
Yeah, the map on the right is from the federal level, whereas the map on the left, I suspect, is from the state level. So yeah, you can see how the federal guidance was drawn up in the mid-50s when the interstate system was being proposed. And then the state got a hold of it and said, well, we can take these alignments and, you know, route them a certain way to disproportionately harm certain groups of people.
Unfortunately, yes.
So, as we take a look at maps, prior to the interstate system, you have really a pretty standard crossroads of the U.S. highway system. On this map on the left, we've got, you know, U.S. 11, U.S. 31 is in there, U.S. 78 comes and goes through town. And then the freeway building begins. In the early 60s, you see parts of Interstates 65 and 59 taking shape, either right through town or to the west of town. Other highways, such as I-20, I-459, and I-65, appear on this map on the right in the early 60s as dotted lines. If we fast forward a few years later in the decade, you can see how much more progress is made in town. On 20 and 59 eastward through town, you have 65 north and south. You also have the Red Mountain Expressway, which is this highway right in here. That's this one, and on this map it's right in here. That's sort of the eastern leg of the downtown loop. That's taken shape by now. As we'll talk about, I-459 was a bit of a latecomer to the party. It didn't really get going until later in the decade, but it is still down here on a dotted line. And here's the system that we have today. 20 and 59 join together at the east end of town and run concurrently westward through the rest of the state, out towards Tuscaloosa and Meridian, Mississippi, which I think is one of the longest mainline concurrencies in the interstate system in terms of miles. Does anybody want to, in your trivia question for tonight, in the words of Howard Eskin, to win the $100 gift certificate to DeBruno Brothers, can you name the longest mainline interstate concurrency in the nation? I think I know what it is. I think. But I wonder if anybody in the live chat knows which one it is. Anyway, so there's that. 65 runs north-south. I-22 is a bit of a newcomer, which we'll talk about in a little bit. And 459 is sort of the eastern bypass, the southern/eastern quadrant of a half-built full beltway. Laura, would you like to talk about buses?
I would like to talk about buses, and not just the top 10 90s buses. I realize I keep plugging Todd in the Shadows' channel.
I sense a theme here. Yeah. But you would like to talk about the Birmingham Express, right?
I would.
Well, why don't you? Have fun.
I will. This is my top number one bus of 2022.
Okay.
It actually just opened September 22nd, 2022. It is a bus rapid transit line that has 18 stops that goes, it's an east-west line, or more, southwest to northeast. But basically it connects neighborhoods all the way across Birmingham, with the center of the city in the middle, to downtown from the Woodlawn Transit Center in the east to the Crossplex Transit Center in the west. When it opened, it was said to, I guess one of the big things is that big appeal is that it provides access to over 70,000 jobs, which is no small thing for, a city this size. The one downside is that there's no connection to the airport on this bus rapid transit line. I've not done the research to, dig into why that is, but I will say, as somebody who lives in a city or outside of a city that should have a new light rail line right now, I'm not going to let perfect be the enemy of the good. And I'm very happy that Birmingham is getting new public transit. And in fact, on my 35th birthday this year, Federal Secretary of Transportation, Pete Buttigieg, announced in Birmingham the Reconnecting Communities program, which is a program, and did so in the context of, this line is opening, and we're announcing the Reconnecting Communities program, which is providing $1 billion in grant money over the next 5 years, dedicated to reconnecting communities that were previously cut off from economic opportunities by transportation infrastructure. So while the original draft of that was for the infrastructure bill, the number was planned as $20 billion, and it got, cut down to $1 billion. Again, I think this is a great start. And a quote that I love that he said is that there's nothing sacred about the status quo. These highways, roads, and railways are not rivers, lakes, or mountains. They're not divinely ordained. They're decisions, and we can make better decisions than what came before. I think that's very lovely. And as much, I know I come on this channel a lot and bring this very sad and depressing history. And I think that it can be hard, right? Because we love roads. We love transportation. And it's hard to talk about this history. But at the same time, we can do things to change the history. And I'll talk some more about some other changes that have recently come about. Some good throughout, since the 50s and 60s, in the later in the 70s. And then, this bus rapid transit project today, another project that I'll tease that I'll talk about in a little bit. But yeah, so I think that I'm really glad that Dan provides me this avenue to share this history, because it's important to learn so that we can move forward and make decisions about, what's next. And whether that means, when roads are, when roads need to be rebuilt or repaired, the sort of decisions that we make around that.
A wise man once said that something to the effect of, tradition is just peer pressure from dead people. So there should be no reason why we can't have these conversations and apply modern day contemporary sets of rules to contemporary situations. And
yeah.
Part of that is able to happen because we have the ability to talk about it. And
exactly.
So I think dialogue is a good thing.
It is.
Because oftentimes when you actually get adults in a room and you talk about things, you often come out better on the other side for having done so.
I agree.
How would you characterize, speaking of adults getting in a room and talking with each other, this kind of segues right into one of the main talking points in the Birmingham freeway system, which isn't just the initial creation of the 2059 freeway, but also the recent replacement of the viaduct that was completed a couple of years ago. Where do you want to go with that? There's a lot that we could unpack here just with that project.
Oh, yes.
I don't know. Where do you want to go with that?
Well, do we want to start talking about the history of I-20 and 59? Or should I say I-59-20?
Make sure you confuse people by using the two interchangeably. Yeah.
Oh, of course. That's the best way to confuse people. So I guess the question is, do we want to talk about the project first, or do we want to talk about its history first?
Well, why don't we start at the beginning?
Okay.
Because the initial construction of this highway was controversial because of what you showed us on the map a few minutes ago.
Oh, yes.
And I'm sure there's other stuff, too, that you could bring up. But why don't we start there and kind of work our way more toward the present day?
Yeah. So, so as I said, two things happened in the construction of this road. Basically, parts of it were built to serve as, walls between, white and black neighborhoods. And then parts of it were intentionally curved to go through black neighborhoods to avoid white ones. Gosh, there's so much to say. I guess if we're going to start all the way at the beginning, I suppose, starts in 1950. I think it's worth saying that, remember earlier I mentioned about Christmas Day 1956 is when you started having bombings and protests and things. And so interestingly, some of the earliest information I pulled up about this highway starts in 1957. Imagine that. So basically, in 1957, College Hill residents, so College Hills was a white neighborhood, they were worried about, and they wanted their political leaders to explore all possible routes in the preservation of the character of their neighborhood. Oh, doesn't that, sound familiar? NIMBYs today often still will use those sorts of words. So basically what's very important about this is that one of the black neighborhoods on the other side of College Hills is Smithfield, which was one of the more affluent black neighborhoods in Birmingham. And it was where black professionals lived, where there were new ranch style homes, and basically the road was put up as a wall and in some spots, and then just thrown right in the middle of other spots of this neighborhood. And it was, and so it's, so even, and so it's not a coincidence that this happened, because basically some of the residents of this neighborhood included, John and Deanie Drew, who were prominent supporters of the civil rights movement, and their house was where Dr. King would often stay in his trips to Birmingham. And, the neighborhood on Center Street was actually known as Dynamite Hill because of all the bombings. And by putting the interstate through, it basically affirming that, it was almost like a punishment, right? That this was being done for political reasons. And in fact, had the residents read the response of Rex Whitten, federal highway administrator, to an inquiry from U.S. Senator, Senator Sparkman, sorry. So Whitten wrote Senator Sparkman that the present location was proposed by the state and approved by the Bureau of Public Roads based on a thorough evaluation of all engineering, economic, and sociological factors involved. Yeah, so that's more on the west side. On the east side, East Birmingham and East Lake. So in order to avoid the White Woodlawn neighborhood, there were many curves and twists that were put into the East Birmingham and the East Lake Black neighborhoods. And it's interesting, right? Because where's the quote? So basically the community organizers that were against this curvy route, their preferred routing for the interstate was actually, which was a much straighter route, was recommended by the Alabama Highway Department and U.S. Bureau of Public Roads. But the problem is that road went through, White Woodlawn neighborhood. So instead, the Alabama Highway Department selected the less direct and probably more expensive route that required lower speeds. So they chose something less efficient and more expensive. Another, and I guess one last big thing on I-59/20 was that it runs along the southern boundary of the predominantly Black Ensley community, near the west boundary of Birmingham. And where this gets kind of interesting is that the city used the Interstate Highway Program along with the Federal Urban Renewal Program to create the racial boundary between the Tuxedo neighborhood, located at the southern edge of Ensley, and the Ensley Highlands neighborhood. So basically, and what they did was they used the highway, very directly for quote unquote slum clearance in order to build public housing, and basically use the money from the interstate towards the urban renewal. And they had no qualms about doing that. And they basically, they deflected any criticism of spending urban renewal funds to clear the highway site. So it ended up, so it's very interesting because there was apparently not a lot of coordination at the beginning, but then eventually they did, because the public housing site was supposed to be much larger than it ultimately ended up being. But then there was coordination, and they figured out a way to make it work and put up the highway as the boundary, and the clearing for the highway as the excuse for, in like a way to kill two birds with one stone, so to speak.
All right, so let's talk about the elevated highway.
Oh yes.
And so the initial iteration of that was put up in the mid-'60s. Ran right through the Central Business District. Very much a product of early interstate highway design. And kind of following the trend of a lot of cities, not just in the South, but across the country, of putting up these huge elevated freeways right through what we consider nowadays to be valuable real estate, downtown areas, waterfront property, etc., etc. So Birmingham was no exception in that regard either. And so come 50 years later, the existing freeway is nearing the end of its useful life. And Alabama officials and Birmingham City officials had to make a decision on what to do with the existing highway. And we're going to do something on this show and in the next couple of shows where we discuss what I call the 3 R's. And this is when you are faced with a decision of an urban highway's usefulness in the future. You have basically 3 options. You can either replace the highway in place with a new facility. You can relocate it, which is to say you can build a new highway on a different alignment somewhere and abandon the original alignment for, urban renewal and urban growth in the path of the former freeway. Or you can remove outright with no real replacement. Birmingham chose the first of these options, the replace in place. But of course they did look into other options. Laura, can you briefly go through what the decision-making process was for that and how they arrived at it?
Sure. So the first considerations for replacing 2059 came about in the early 2000s. And in 2004, in the Urban Design Associates 2004 update of the Birmingham City Master Plan, they actually put in there as the replacement to lower the freeway underground, and then be able to put parks and new development, create like new neighborhood space above it. And in 2009, the firm Parsons Brinkerhoff, which a lot of people in the planning world know is, kind of a big deal firm, Parsons Brinkerhoff determined that lowering the roadway was possible. It would cost $700 million and take 3 years to complete, during which time the corridor could remain open to traffic. And that this would also bring other long-term economic benefits to the city through new construction and development of housing, retail, office space, and tax revenue. And it could it would be an opportunity to sew the city back together psychologically and sociologically. And some examples of places where this has happened is like Dallas with the Woodall-Rogers Freeway, or Atlanta, the Georgia Tech 5th Street Bridge. So in 2011, Alabama's DOT planned to repair the aging bridge decks instead at the cost of $125 million. Because their thought was, oh no, $700 million, that's too expensive. We're just going to replace the decks. But then, chunks of the freeway started falling off the bridge, off the viaduct. Then they had to close public parking. And then they, determined that this was pretty insufficient, that, they needed to do a full replacement and widening at the cost of $450 million instead. And so their justification for that was that the current road has no shoulders, that, there was forced weaving of, cars in between lanes, they could, fix up the exits better. And there was high congestion because the viaduct was designed for 80,000 vehicles a day and carried 160,000. And that, it outdated the lifespan because it opened in 1973, with a 50-year lifespan, which would then be 2023. So, neighborhoods and even city council leaders got upset by this. And so in 2015, the Move 2059 organization was established, and they filed a lawsuit for Alabama DOT to consider alternatives. So the alternatives that could have been considered were to, one, bury the interstate, or that they could they could relocate the interstate along the Finley Boulevard corridor, or they could do what's called the short Finley route, which would have been slightly south of Finley Boulevard. It's very there's actually Alabama DOT actually has a website that lists out all these alternatives and why they, in their opinion, they don't work. So for them, burying the interstate was space constraints, utility relocation. It would require hazardous curves and inclines, storm draining issues, and a long road closure. I thought the long road closure was interesting because, the consulting firms earlier said that wouldn't need to be the case. Moving the road north on Finley Boulevard would cause a lot of demolition of businesses on the corridor, and then along the short Finley route, it would avoid demolition of the businesses, but would require widening of I-65 and properties destroyed in Enon Ridge and Fountain Heights, which are historically African-American neighborhoods. And that it would also be in the Village Creek floodplain, and that the costs would be huge and take more than 20 years to complete. The lawsuit was dismissed in 2016. Ultimately, in 2019, to January 2019, January 2020, they closed 2059 for a year to completely, rebuild the viaducts. But something that did come out of this process, even though they decided to rebuild in place, they did do something. They didn't just rebuild the road in place. They kind of came to a compromise. They created what's called CityWalk Bham, which is a 10-mile long park under the bridge. It goes from 15th Street to 25th Street, and has lots of, each block is sort of like a different zone of different things as far as, recreational sports, skate park, performance space, market space, plaza, dog park, pond, playground, all that sort of stuff. Is that the same as burying the highway and building, building these community spaces on top? No, it's not. I've not been there. They just opened CityWalk in 2022. And it looks very beautiful. And I'm sure it's going to get a lot of good use, but it's not quite the same because the highway is still there above. Interestingly, CityWalk has hours of operation between 7 a.m. to 7 p.m. So it's not like regular neighborhood streets that are open all the time. And then but what's very interesting is that there's some private facilities in there that are open later. So there's the skate park is often open till 10. The pickleball courts open till 10. And the Barkery Dog Park, which is a membership-based off-leash dog park, which just blows my mind. That's a thing. A membership-based dog park just screams the opposite of equity to me. Let's build a park, except we're going to make part of it membership-based. And then just the fact that if the park is closed at 7 p.m., but these other facilities are open later, how do you get to them? Do you have to drive to them? Can you walk through the park to them? Or is that not allowed? I'm kind of curious about that. Again, I do think it's great that they did build this park. And like I said, it looks lovely, and I'm sure it's going to get a lot of use. But and I think it's going to heal the scars somewhat, but I don't think it's going to heal the scars in the same way that burying the freeway would have. I think relocating it would have created new scars, and, that wouldn't have really solved the problem either. I think that but really what it comes down to is we're talking about two different constituencies here, right? Highway engineers aren't designing social spaces. They're designing, freeways for vehicles. Right, that's not your job.
Yep.
You and I have very different jobs. Mm-hmm. You're an engineer. You want to make sure that these things are built to code and built to get vehicles across. And I'm a planner that's all like about community development and, sociological, stuff. So these are very different goals. So it's not surprising that, these goals clash together. And often will end up in a result that makes either one side or the other unhappy. That because they're very different goals.
I hear you. Yeah. But every city has to come to their own decision ultimately. And I agree that the relocation idea was not appropriate, as it would have just caused more chaos in other parts of the city.
Yeah.
And really removal didn't make a whole lot of sense either. just considering the amount of traffic that follows I-20 and I-59. Remember that 59 is one of the main highways that connects the Gulf Coast with the Northeast. 59 starts in New Orleans, heads up to eastern Tennessee, where you can pick up I-75 and I-81. So it's a major thoroughfare for commercial traffic, as is I-20, connecting Dallas with Atlanta. Removing a freeway that's that heavily traveled by trucks, just to me, is not a possible option. Even though they did look into it, but I think ultimately the right decision was made in this case. And we can talk about other cities and their decisions, and whether they were right or not, in future episodes, I'm sure.
Yeah, and it's I feel like I said, I would love to visit Birmingham now that CityWalk is there and see what because maybe CityWalk will heal those wounds. Of course, I would have preferred the burial of the freeway, but again, you and I have different focuses. So, your first thought is like, oh my gosh, this road is, connects the Gulf to the Northeast, and it very much does. And my first thought is, oh my gosh, communities. So yeah. Which is why you're an engineer and I'm a planner.
I guess so. But yeah, I mean, those are the kinds of things that take many years to study. And the impacts of the freeway replacement and the urban park space that was created, we're going to be examining that stuff for decades.
Oh, definitely.
Just to kind of see how the communities have adapted, how they've adjusted, whether there are new pedestrian traffic patterns that are introduced into the mix. All those things, that seem rather meaningless on the surface, they all contribute to the welfare of a city and its population. So those are interesting metrics that I'm sure the right people will be taking a look at in the years ahead.
Yes.
In the wake of that viaduct replacement. Yes. Well, let's deal with some other business here in the area. I want to talk about I-22. It's a relatively new mainline interstate. In fact, the idea of a freeway connecting Birmingham and Memphis goes all the way back to the 1950s. During the post-World War II years, the creation of the federal aid highway system in the mid-50s, there was discussion about building a highway between those two cities then, but it didn't advance beyond the planning stages at the time. It wasn't until the 1970s when things really got moving. The Appalachian Development Highway System became a thing in the 60s and 70s. Longtime viewers of the program will know that we have talked about the ADHS system at length. Certain corridors further north, say in West Virginia, that we've profiled. Congress approved the designation of the corridor between Birmingham and Memphis as ADHS Corridor X in 1978. It was officially designated as part of the future I-22 corridor in 2004. Gradually, interstate upgrades were made in the following decade, plus, and the interstate was completed in 2016 and signed as such. There is a pretty significant terminal interchange at I-65, which was designed to continue. There are actually unused overpasses and stub ramps at that interchange, and what that was intended to do was build a small connector that would have continued the highway further east about a half of a mile to connect with U.S. Route 31. As that construction went underway, it was realized at the last moment that the connection wasn't really a high priority, and so they built the overpasses and they provided space at that interchange, at that 2265 interchange, to enable its addition in the future. but as of right now, it has not been completed. So you can go and see those unused stub highway or stub bridges yourself at this point. So that's the story on 22. 65, where I-22 has its eastern terminus, runs to the north and the south. It connects the largest cities of Alabama, Huntsville to the north, Birmingham, Montgomery, and then all the way down to the Gulf Coast. Within the city, or in the metro area of Birmingham, construction of this highway took about 25 years to complete. Perhaps the single biggest highlight of your trip through town on 65 is the interchange that for the longest time was known as Malfunction Junction, and that's the junction between 65 and I-59 right at the western edge of downtown, until it was rebuilt into the form that it has today, where it's a lot wider. There are a lot more lanes. There are actually merging areas now. That wasn't always the case. The 65 main line actually does cross over and under itself, which is an interesting feature. There are left-hand exits and entrances, but as I said, it's a much more orderly confluence of roadways and ramps than it used to be. So, and this project, by the way, the rebuilding of Malfunction Junction, was the first phase of the project to rebuild the I-5920 viaduct downtown. Because what they wanted to make sure was that before they did the full shutdown of the 59 through downtown, they wanted to have these ramps rebuilt to facilitate easier detour movements through the city center. So they completed that project, and then they got underway on the viaduct replacement that we've already talked about.
Yeah, I've got some stuff to say about I-65.
Okay.
So, similar deal to I-5920 is, that it was built along historic racial boundaries. The neighborhood just southeast of Malfunction Junction is Fountain Heights, which was historically white, but underwent a racial transformation between 1950 and 1960. The black population actually went from almost 1,400 people to 2,200 people in that time. This is actually the neighborhood where 16th Street Baptist Church was in Fountain Heights. And, between 1956 and 1958, the homes of 7 black families were bombed in the neighborhood. And then, the 16th Street bombing in 1963. The 6th Street routing for I-65 between Enon Ridge and Fountain Heights was announced in May 1958 during that 2-year period where those 7 bombings happened in Fountain Heights. So the fact that these two things happened at the same time, the bombings plus the choosing the alignment, very much raises the likelihood that it was purposely located to stop black residents from basically to keep them out of Fountain Heights. I mean, ironically, we talk about all this, right? About how these neighborhoods were built. These roads were built to stop integration, but ultimately integration eventually did happen. And the city became actually predominantly African American in the 1980s. So so actually they failed. These roads failed in that context. They failed to be a wall racially. They became, these psychological walls with, and physical walls between neighborhoods, but they didn't stop, integration.
No, they didn't, but they also facilitated white flight.
Oh, yes, they did.
Which is another reason why the population demographic changed so much.
Oh, yeah, because now that you have a highway that you can take very easily to the suburbs, then, if you're a white resident of Fountain Heights and you suddenly don't like, that you have black neighbors, oh, look, now I have I-65. I can just move to the suburbs.
That's right.
And just take I-65 to work. So definitely, increased white flight. Um, yeah, so and then according to one other thing about I-65, interesting note, according to a consultant's 1961 report, the I-65 corridor between 10th and 11th Streets North was deliberately placed to create a western boundary between downtown Birmingham, and with the recognition that a substantial clearance of slum housing could be accomplished along the right-of-way. So again, all of these same themes. Fortunately, this is the last, like those are the two big highways, right, that have all of these things. A little bit later, we'll have a slightly different story to bring up with a different highway.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Yeah, the magic words, slum clearance.
Yep.
Right. I mean, you basically hear those words in pretty much every major city somewhere along the way, right? When it comes to urban redevelopment or freeway planning and construction, you hear those two words pretty much exclusively everywhere. So, so it's not surprising to see it in this case either.
Yeah.
The Red Mountain Expressway is interesting.
Yes, it is.
Let's get off the interstate system for a second.
Yes.
It is the eastern arm of. It's not really a loop. There isn't a full loop that encircles downtown, but if you imagine the downtown loop in Birmingham as sort of like a C shape, where the Red Mountain is now the eastern arc of that C shape. So it runs north to south, connecting the east edge of downtown with the immediate suburbs on the opposite side of Red Mountain. Now, this is an interesting example of what engineers go through when they plan highways, especially in urban areas. So the original thought here was that they were going to put a tunnel through Red Mountain, but it was decided that they would just blast away the mountain because that was actually the cheaper option. So there's this huge rock cut in the highway right as you pass through the hillside there. It's not the kind of thing that you can easily miss either. And if I show you a video of it later, you'll see what I'm talking about. So the Red Mountain cut was a prominent highlight in this highway's construction. Another highlight, I would say it's more of a low light, was the demolition of the Birmingham Railroad Terminal in the late 1960s. This highway's right-of-way stands on part of the real estate of the old Birmingham Terminal, which was the original railroad station for the city of Birmingham. As we have a couple of slides here that show you, there's a couple old postcards and there's a couple old photos as well. Very beautiful building, built in the early 1900s. Maybe not the most spectacular looking railroad station you've ever seen, but certainly in the Birmingham context, it was a beautiful place, and it was raised in the late 1960s. This sign, by the way, that is front and center on your screen, it was a steel sign, and it had the words Birmingham, the Magic City, and there were neon lights on the letters that would light up at night, and the sign was about 50 feet high. So it was this huge thing that stood right at the portal to the rail station downtown. It was torn down in, I believe, sometime in the late 50s, because the city got tired of having to maintain it. So they basically got an inspector to give the thing a failing grade, which justified their ability to tear it down. So they did not do a good job of preserving what was arguably the most beautiful sign in the whole city. There are other cities around that have done much more to preserve their original old neon signs. Tulsa, Oklahoma comes to mind. In fact, Laura, you've been in Wildwood, New Jersey, I know, somewhat recently, and so I know you've come to recognize some of the old signs and the old neon hotel signs that are still in that beach town.
Oh, absolutely.
Yeah, they're just great, and it's another one of these weird things that just doesn't really make a whole lot of sense. Like, why would you just blow something like that up? You know, it.
Well,
it doesn't.
I've got some, so the interesting thing about, no, I can't speak it directly for the sign, but I actually, when you have a 3-year-old, sometimes you have to do research for these videos at, 4 in the morning, or you have to finish up research an hour before.
Uh-huh.
Which, are 2 things that have happened in the past day.
Okay.
Well, really in past weeks. But I've got some news for you, actually. I was doing some more research regarding the Birmingham Terminal Station, and the history of it's a little more interesting than it was. It actually was not torn down for the freeway.
It was not torn down for the freeway, but it was condemned, and it was just conveniently routed that way because they knew they were going to get rid of it.
Ooh, no, it was not. So let's talk about the success story. And in fact, the paper I was referencing, right? The one by Dr. Connerly, he actually, the section of the paper where he talks about this, he actually calls from racial zoning to empowerment, the Central City Public Housing Development, and the Red Mountain Expressway. So basically, what happened with the Birmingham Terminal Station, and some of this research is supplemental, but I'm filling in some blanks here. But basically, by 1960, only 26 trains per day went through Terminal Station, and the station actually served as the site of numerous episodes of the Civil Rights Movement. Because the idea, that Reverend Shuttlesworth, led protests to challenge, the segregation on trains and at the station. But by the time it was beginning in 1969, it was down to only 7 trains a day going through the station. And in 1969, the U.S. Social Security Administration announced plans to build a consolidated service center in downtown Birmingham. And they bought the site, and a sad thing to happen on my birthday, right? We had a good thing, right? Pete, in 2022 on my birthday, right? With Pete Buttigieg. Sad thing on my birthday is that the approval for the demolition was on June 30th, 1969. The idea was that Social Security was going to build a whole new complex there. But by 1974, they changed their mind. And that's important, going back to, a success story regarding, saving a neighborhood, right? So basically, the Red Mountain routing was originally not going to go on that site of the Birmingham Terminal Station. It was instead going to go through the Central City Housing Project, which is just west of the station. And it was going to, eliminate 200 to 400 dwelling units. But then, ironically, even after the terminal station was demolished, they weren't going to move it. The highway department was like, we already made these plans. Too bad. Even after the Social Security Administration said that they weren't going to build on the site. So they were still planning to, demolish this public housing project, which is an insult to injury because there were literally residents there, like Melinda Cobb, who had been, this was not her first time being displaced by highways. If I move this time, it will make 3 times and I'm tired of it. She said, recalling her homes in Eastlake and Avondale. So literally you have people that were moved for the construction of, 5920, moved to this public housing project, and then we're going to get moved again in order for the Red Mountain Expressway, which is just awful. So basically, then they had to fight in order for there to be replacement housing. And then they were like, well, we can't replace all the housing, but we can replace the housing for the elderly, which is racially motivated because the majority of the elderly residents that live there were white and the families were black. And, but then they were like, no, we can't plan a new route. It's going to take all this time. It'll take 6 to 7 years. And basically, although the housing authority could not, enforce racial segregation, the fact that the replacement facility was not going to be available to these families, it was de facto, racism. So basically what ended up happening is that Central City residents, in cooperation with the Alabama State Tenants Organization, they filed a suit on December 19th, 1974 against Alabama Highway Department, Birmingham Housing Authority, against U.S. Housing and Urban Development and Federal Highway Administration. And basically their suit alleged that Highway Department had not, followed all the requirements of the Uniform Relocation Act and Environmental Public Statement. So NEPA, National Environmental Policy Act, and, several other acts, Civil Rights Act of 64, Housing Act 1937. But basically, eventually, through various rulings of this suit, which, means appeals, right, that the Alabama Highway Department ultimately, had to comply with federal requirements to find alternatives. So in June 1977, they began examining 4 alternatives. And basically, throughout the summer of 77, ASTO negotiated with the Highway Department on behalf of city residents. In November 1977, Alabama Governor George Wallace signed an agreement that provided one-on-one replacement housing for the Central City displaced residents and provided tenants the right to influence decisions about the location and design of replacement units. But then after all of that, they decided.
Let's start to bring this to a conclusion here. So
I am. I have 2 sentences left.
Okay.
Oh yeah. So ultimately, they, after studying the alternatives, 3 years later, in 1980, they decided, hey, why don't we just put it where the Birmingham terminal was? And just bypass Central City entirely. And then as a bonus, the housing authority announced plans to renovate Central City. So in the mid 1980s, all 910 units were renovated, and then in the early 2000s, Metropolitan Gardens, as it was renamed, was demolished, and then it became rebuilt as a mixed-income Hope 6 project as the Park Place Apartments. So all of that to say is that it ended up being a success story with a lot of fighting in order to save the neighborhood and save people who had already been displaced from being displaced again.
Well, all right. I guess I look at it more. I don't really see it as a success story necessarily because I don't know. I don't really like the fact that they tore down the terminal.
Well,
that's kind of what I agree. Get stuck on. So
I agree. So it's not a success story in that the terminal was torn down, but the success story is, I suppose, that the terminal was not torn down for the freeway, and B, that after it was torn down, the land ended up being used for the freeway in order to save a neighborhood.
Okay.
So, yeah. And actually, I think that's the end of pretty much all of my content.
Really? You don't have jack for the rest of these roads we got to talk about?
I mean, you told me I had 5 to 7 minutes. What have you timed me as at this point?
Going on 5 to 7 hours, maybe. Well, you're good. Yeah, so, all right. Well, good. So I get to talk some more. All right.
You get to talk some more. The floor is yours.
All right. Well, then, thank you. You can go get a drink of water if you want.
I think I will.
Okay. 459. This is a pretty, as we move on to some other freeways in the area, pretty straightforward bypass to the south and the east of the metro area. It serves an eastern bypass for the metro area. if you like 4-level stack interchanges, you might like a drive along I-459 because there are two of them within close proximity of each other. One of them is at I-65, and the other one is at the eastern I-20 interchange and I think they're again within a few miles of each other. It's crazy to think that Birmingham has more 4-level stack interchanges than New York City. But that's the case. Yeah, New York City only has one symmetrical 4-level stack. Whereas Birmingham has the two that are located along I-459.
Wow.
459 is also the home of something known as Miss Liberty, which is a 36-foot tall bronze replica of the Statue of Liberty in New York City. I think it's a 1/5 scale model of the one in New York Harbor. It was originally built atop the Liberty National Life Insurance Building in downtown Birmingham in 1958. It was moved to its current location in 1988 to save it from the wrecking ball. And it now stands on a pedestal in what became known as Liberty Park, some green space adjacent to I-459 out in the suburbs. And you can't miss it when you're driving by on the freeway. I should mention at this point that when they were planning the freeway system around Birmingham, they originally had a full beltway around the metro area. 459 is the only piece of that has seen the light of day to this point. There is something else I would like to say about that on a future slide in this show in a little bit. We're not quite done talking about freeway bypasses of Birmingham. This next road is not at all a bypass. It is a connector, connecting I-59 and 20 with downtown Tuscaloosa. I-359, it's a short little highway. If you blink, you'll miss it. A short spur into downtown. It also serves the University of Alabama's primary campus, which is in Tuscaloosa. And I drove all the way out here to Tuscaloosa just so that I could drive this road, so I could say that I clinched all the 3DIs in the state of Alabama.
Ooh.
While we're in Tuscaloosa, now many of you out there might not realize that Alabama has toll roads, but in fact it does. Then one of those is here in Tuscaloosa. It's known as the West Bypass. It's not really a toll road. The toll booth that is in place is for the bridge that crosses the Black Warrior River west of downtown. So it's really a toll bridge with long approach roads on either end. In Alabama, there is no shared, what do you call it? What's the word I'm thinking of? Like, you can't use Easy Pass or Sun Pass or any of that.
No interoperability.
Yeah, thank you.
You're welcome.
No interoperability with other out-of-state toll tags. Alabama does have a toll tag of their own. It's called the Freedom Pass. Why the hell it's called that, I don't know.
I wonder.
Yeah, they love their freedom down there. I believe there are 3 roads that the Freedom Pass is accepted on. One of them is this one. There's another toll road bypass, which is another similar toll bridge kind of situation in Montgomery. And then there's another bridge down on the Gulf Coast somewhere, I think. I think those are the 3. There might be one other one that I'm forgetting about, but those are the 3 ones that come to mind for me right away. So anyway, you can use this Freedom Pass on those 3 roads, but you can use it out of state, and you cannot use, Sun Pass or Easy Pass in Alabama for this road. So it's an interoperability nightmare, and it's very easy to shun Pike. You just don't have to go over the bridge. You could save the $1 and not even bother.
I do want to add something.
Okay.
So, for those of you out there who, like me, don't always get sarcasm, I think I know why it's called freedom. In regards to all of this, all of the conversation we've been having regarding civil rights.
Okay.
So National Freedom Day is February 1st. And it was on that day in 1865 when President Abraham Lincoln signed what would later become the 13th Amendment, which is the amendment that abolishes slavery.
Okay.
And, so I actually mentioned in the Selma to Montgomery video about, protests happening on Freedom Day. And at the time, I didn't really, I guess, get the full implication of what that was. I think I just kind of, it was like, oh yeah, so apparently it was Freedom Day. I remember later after that video being like, oh, well, don't I feel dumb? That I didn't realize that Freedom Day is not just like, ooh, freedom. It's like, oh, freedom.
It's an interesting idea. Do I think that's the reason? No. Not necessarily. But I don't know.
I think if nothing else, it's an interesting tie, right? To the topics we've been talking about.
Well, yeah, I mean, if you think about it that way, yeah.
Yes.
That's true.
Yes.
Yeah. So, anyway, Laura's going to do some more research on that and report back to us for next week's show.
I actually will not be on next week's show. It's my family.
You said you were going to be available for that.
No, next week is my family's extended family holiday Christmas party.
Oh, I think you did tell me about that.
I did. That's actually why we had this episode tonight.
Yeah, well, you can cancel that. That's not a big deal.
I can't cancel my family.
Oh, yes, you can. It's not that hard. Screw you, family. Yeah, screw your parents.
No.
Yeah, you're not. Okay, all right. That's cool.
But I do plan to be on the Syracuse episode.
All right, well, you can report back in 2 weeks. How's that sound?
That sounds good. In 2 weeks, I will report back.
Here's a map of the on-again, off-again idea for an eastern bypass around Tuscaloosa that is probably, if they ever did build this, would also be built with some sort of toll road elements in it. Certainly at the Black Warrior River, there would probably be another toll bridge. The thing you need to know about this is that it's out there being talked about. I don't know if it's on the horizon anytime soon. There's a lot of environmental litigation that would have to be worked through in order for this road to even start construction. So I wouldn't plan your 2023 getaway to Tuscaloosa if you're looking to drive the new Eastern Bypass. It ain't going to happen that quickly, folks.
But if you're looking for a good HBCU, Tuscaloosa's the place.
No,
well, other than Morgan State University, because that's where I graduated from.
Well, which one's in Tuscaloosa?
Why am I drawing a blank? Isn't it? It's why am I drawing a blank?
I don't know.
It's Stillman. Oh my God, Stillman is the one.
Okay.
Stillman College.
See, I didn't even know that there was one in Tuscaloosa, but okay.
Oh, yes.
All right.
Yeah.
Cool. Real quick, 759 really came about because in the early 1970s, the sleepy town of Gadsden became a traffic hellhole thanks to the construction of the Gadsden Mall on the western side of town. And so, trying to figure out a way to relieve the traffic congestion in town, they came up with a freeway connector idea to connect the town with I-59 more directly. And so the 759 freeway was born out of that situation. Again, it's another short highway. It's easy to miss. The thing you should know about the future for this road is that there are extension plans on the books both to the east and to the west. The State Highway 759 designation applies to the eastern roughly half to 3/4 of a mile of the freeway. If these extension plans were built, the state highway designation would go away completely and we would just be left with a fully interstate compatible highway. Actually, on this slide here in the bottom right, you can see the stub roadway for what would be the continuation of 759 westbound beyond what is currently the western terminus of the freeway. We don't just like to talk about Birmingham on this show. I felt while I was creating this PowerPoint that I needed something else to help fill it in. So I'm introducing some stuff in Huntsville into the mix. Let's talk
Yay,
about
Huntsville!
I-565, which is the east-west freeway across Huntsville, which, by the way, is the largest city in Alabama by population. Its nickname is Rocket City. It gets its name from the presence of NASA, the Marshall Space Flight Center. Also, the U.S. Army's Redstone Arsenal is in town. And those two facilities really helped propel Huntsville into national spotlight. And with that extra spotlight came a heck of a lot more traffic. And what was originally a much smaller community well off of the interstate all of a sudden was a city of strategic importance that really needed an interstate highway connection. And so I-565 was added to the system in the 1980s. It was built from 1987 to 91. One of the more prominent highlights along the drive, which you can see, I have it up on this slide right now, the picture in the lower right. The freeway runs right past the U.S. Space and Rocket Center, which is a large museum complex. The full-scale mock-up Saturn V rocket is positioned right alongside the highway. You can't miss it. As of 2022, in fact, the Saturn V remains the only launch vehicle to carry humans beyond low Earth orbit. And this includes the Apollo program and the Apollo lunar landings in the late 1960s and early 1970s. And so the full-scale mock-up of that rocket is on display right alongside the interstate for you to check out. I also have heard from reliable sources that that museum is really kick-ass, and you should check that out too if you're ever in Huntsville.
I definitely want to go back to Huntsville to A, visit a particular road geek and their family, and B, to check out that museum. I've actually been to Huntsville and been on I-565. Because interestingly, I went on a caving spring break trip when I was an undergrad. Caving as in like spelunking. And the National Speleological Society is actually in Huntsville, and we went to their headquarters. And they were so excited that they had visitors, because they don't normally, I guess, get visitors.
Well, they don't get visitors as happy as you.
Well, thank you. That might be true.
I think that definitely is true. So that was 565. We have one last little topic to discuss here. Here's a road for you. When you think about building new highways, generally you think that they connect population centers or they bypass a very congested part of an existing freeway system. I struggle to figure out what the heck the purpose of this highway even is, the one that's on our screen right now. Now, remember how I said a few minutes ago that back in the early days of Birmingham's freeway planning, they were originally envisioning a full beltway around the city. The only section that ever saw construction was the 459 section, which, let's be honest, makes perfect logistical sense, because if you're coming up from the west on 2059, a lot of that, I would think that most of that traffic is going to follow 20 east towards Atlanta, or it's going to stay on 59 to head up towards Tennessee. So strategically putting the bypass east of town creates a bit of a shortcut for long-distance traffic, and that's exactly what we've seen happen over the years with 459. That's exactly the purpose that it serves. And also, of course, the redundancy of having a second highway to bypass what was then a very substandard freeway downtown. That was another plus. In the 80s, federal and local officials started to look into possibly completing the rest of the loop that had been abandoned very early on in the early 60s. One of the reasons why it was abandoned in the first place was because there simply wasn't any development out west and north of town. And that kind of still is the case today. If you look at a map, for instance, if you look at this map here, you can see that there's not a whole heck of a lot going on in this northern and western quadrant of the metro. Most of the development that took place was either along existing interstates 20 and 59. There's a little bit of suburban sprawl along the 459. But I mean, most of the metro area is well confined to the city of Birmingham and its immediate suburbs. There's not a whole lot going on out to the west or out to the north. Nevertheless, officials throughout the 80s and the 90s petitioned the federal government for funding. Eventually, this led to the designation of this new part of what would effectively be a full beltway as part of the ADHS system. It is currently known as ADHS Corridor X1, which opens the door for it to receive federal funding and under the ADHS federal funding system. At about the same time, there was discussion about including this highway in the interstate highway system, and that approval was granted as well. It's that the main highway here is part of I-422, the Birmingham Northern Beltline. Now, we do have to talk a little bit about what the heck is going on here with these interstate designations, because as you see, there are two interstate designations on here. It was recognized very early in this highway's planning that a direct interchange between I-22 and I-422 would not only be prohibitively expensive due to the terrain involved, but it would also be terribly destructive environmentally. So what they came up with was this hybrid idea where the two freeways would cross each other but not have a direct connection. The direct connection would be provided by a third highway with two interchanges, one at each end. And you can kind of see what they have in mind as far as that's concerned in this map here on the lower right, where you have the 22 and 422 cross each other, and then a few miles to the east there's this third highway that gets introduced that serves as a sort of connector between the two. That connector highway, interestingly, has been given its own interstate designation. You don't really see a whole lot of that in the American interstate system, but on the books right now it is known as I-222, whereas 422 would be the designation for the bypass proper. So where do things stand on this highway right now? Well, as of the recording of this episode, there has been approximately a mile and a half of construction on this 30-plus mile arc that would begin at the southern 2059-459 interchange and end along I-59 in the northeast suburbs. This construction, which took place between 2014 and 2016, involves simply the grading for the roadway and some interchange ramps in the area of State Highways 79 and 75 out in the Palmerdale area. It did not involve actually paving or opening up that section to traffic. It's a pretty useless short stretch of road by itself. So I would imagine that they would be waiting for adjacent sections to be built before it could actually become useful.
Ooh, is it like a goat path?
It kind of is. I don't think there are any bridges on this contract, but I think you're alluding to the goat path in Pennsylvania, for instance, like east of Lancaster.
Yes, PA 23.
Yeah,
and in fact, yeah. In fact, it's funny because this whole, 422, 222, the fact that there's no, direct connection between, that they have to use 222, it just screams Pennsylvania to me.
Yeah. Well, yeah, and if you head out that way, out north of town, the terrain becomes very hilly, becomes very even borderline mountainous at times. A lot of people don't realize that the Appalachian chain really begins in central Alabama. And it's that same geologic formation that runs all the way up the spine of the eastern U.S. it begins right in this area of central Alabama. And so, yeah, it you might scoff at, well, why in the world are we allocating ADHS funding all the way down here? Well, actually, it does have its merit, because Alabama is very much has an Appalachian feel to it, particularly the northern and eastern parts of the state.
Oh, definitely.
Yeah, so and that definitely has an influence on the engineering of this highway as well. I know that we've talked about the engineering of the ADHS system in episodes past, but some of the same themes that we've talked about as far as environmental issues, as far as the decimation of communities in the path of these highways, these are issues that are going to come up again, with this highway as well. In fact, this is kind of an example of how politicians cook the books on these highways to make them look a lot more attractive than they really are. A 2010 study estimated that 70,000 jobs could be created by the Beltline's construction. However, a few years later, a supplemental study was done that projected that only 2,800 jobs could be added to the area by the year 2050.
Wow.
Yes, and I'm not even sure that 2,800 is accurate. So, well, it's all in the name of job creation, right? Isn't that kind of what people always come back to?
Oh, yes.
The cost estimation, the most recent figure I could find was to build the 30 miles of highway would be about $5.5 billion, which is BS because that's not a recent number, and obviously it doesn't take into account inflation and other unexpected expenses and all that jazz. You're probably looking at $10 billion to build this road, and I'm probably even low still. And I can tell you that the state of Alabama has many more places that $10 billion could go to that would be far more beneficial.
Yes.
I look at, simply put, the single biggest infrastructure project that Alabama could invest in today would be the replacement of the I-10 Bayway in Mobile. And for years, officials in Alabama have been wondering how in the world they're going to come up with the $10 billion to replace the Bayway. Now, it's a little bit different. You're talking about the interstate system versus ADHS funding, so it's not exactly a one-to-one comparison here. And I don't think you can actually, because of the way that the ADHS law was written, I don't think you can just move money from the ADHS realm down to the interstate realm. I don't think it really works that way. But I could give you other examples. There are other ADHS projects that I would say are far more important than this one is. The completion of Corridor T to interstate standards in southern New York is one of them. We know it as I-86. The completion of Corridor M in western Pennsylvania. The upgrading of Corridor B and C in southern Ohio and Kentucky. Those are projects that I think are viable. Corridor D in southern Ohio. So I guess the point is that using valuable funding, spending $10 billion on what in my estimation is a dead-end highway that really isn't going to do you all that much good from a traffic management standpoint, we can't really afford that. That's not smart investing. Not to mention the fact that I don't even know who's going to be served by this road. I said a few minutes ago that there isn't really any development out this way. Well, that's still the case. Nobody lives up that way. So I don't know who this road is being built to serve exactly.
Yeah,
it's not really being built to serve as a bypass. You already have I-459. There's nothing wrong with I-459 as a bypass. If I-459 has any shortcomings, it's that at its two ends it doesn't have enough lanes. But that can be easily rectified. You just put more lanes there. It doesn't justify building a $10 billion highway through the middle of the hills, that nobody's going to use. Now there is one solution here that I would get on board with, and that is I'm okay with them building this if it's a private toll road. I don't want ADHS money involved or interstate highway funding involved. But if they built it as a private toll road, I say go for it. Let them be the ones to, let the Chinese investors be the ones to lose money on it, not the U.S. government.
Yeah, it's interesting. One of the very first talks that you and I had, regarding, highways that, where they really need it were, ADHS highways. Because, whereas we've talked about how urban freeways have depopulated cities, what's ultimately happened in a lot of places where highways have been built in, the ADHS corridors, it's depopulated what little population was there.
Yeah. Well, because remember what I said about, roads being, in the context of what we were talking about with I-65, it was that, the roads enabled white flight, right?
Yeah.
Something similar happens out in West Virginia with these ADHS highways. It just makes it easier to leave.
Yep.
Right? It's not really. Everybody likes to talk about creating jobs or whatever, but if there's no jobs, and if you put in a highway, it's just easier for people to get out of town.
Yeah.
So there's no suburban sprawl happening along the 422 corridor, and I don't see any coming anytime soon because it's not like, again, the whole jobs thing. It's like, well, what is going on in Birmingham that, you would think that the population is spiking out of control the way that people talk about, the need for a 422 bypass. The population in Birmingham has been stagnant the last 30 years.
Yeah.
And as I said, since the 60s, the population of Birmingham proper has dropped almost 50%.
Yeah.
So you can't say that the area is growing. So what is it that they're really trying to get out of this project? I really don't know. This one's a head scratcher for me. And to me, it's just crazy that we're actually thinking about doing this. You prepared a lot of notes tonight, Laura, and you did a fantastic job. And I thank the Lord did not do this for I-422 because I could probably talk for 3 hours about what a terrible idea that road is. But I think I have kind of given you a pretty good outline of what my position is on the whole thing. And I think we should just leave it at that. Spend the $10 billion on the new Bayway, please. It's a much better investment.
Or, obviously you talked about how you can't transfer the funds, but wouldn't it have been nice if 10 years ago we could have used this to bury 5920?
I know. It's so interesting how, we don't have money for certain things, but all of a sudden we magically have money for other things.
Yep.
And there's certain patterns that come up that I know you probably have picked up on.
Oh, yes.
I don't know if we want to get into more trouble than we probably already are in, but
right.
I think you kind of know where I'm going with that.
Yes.
Yeah. So that is our very lengthy overview of Birmingham. Hope you enjoyed it. Man, we kept it going for a while just talking about roads and planning and civil rights history and socioeconomic issues and all of that. And as I said at the onset, there's actually a lot more to unpack here than what you might initially think. And Laura, you did a fantastic job with your notes. I'm glad that I wasn't the one compiling those notes because it seems like you probably had like 800 pages of notes that you were flipping through. But
I did, and thank you.
You did a fantastic job, and I'm very disappointed that you can't be with us for next week's show.
I know.
So I'm gonna be the one that has to come up with 800 pages of notes now, probably for next.
Probably.
Week. Yeah.
Well, if it turns out that I can't sleep within the next week, and I'm up at 3 a.m, I'll send you some notes.
All right. Well, that's cool. That works for me.
No promises, though.
All right. Well, you know what? I won't hold you to it. But Oklahoma City is our city of choice next Saturday. I hope you join us for that. There is already a link on the channel for that. So we hope to see you next week. With our remaining short amount of time, I will show you guys a couple of videos. Laura, how many excerpts from the letter from Birmingham Jail did you want to read?
I can read as few or as many as you want. I mean, I picked out 20 notable quotes. Well, and those particular quotes are not very long. Okay, I realize that saying that means nothing. But basically, I was just going to read, so I found a website, I'm not going to lie. I found a website that, gave me some, that according to them. And I kind of agreed because I've read through the letter from Birmingham Jail and, I found but yes, this particular website, they're, 20 of the best quotes, that they picked out. They're relatively short. So, I don't know. No more than 5 minutes, if that.
Well, I mean, that's fine. I think I probably found the same website as you did. And so I was kind of looking through some stuff as well. But, I'll defer to you on what you want to read as we watch this video of the Birmingham Loop.
Cool. Okay, so this is according to, bookroo.com. And I thought this was a pretty good, compiling of, 20 pretty good quotes, what they name as 20 of the best quotes from Letter from Birmingham Jail. Then I'll just say the numbers so that we can, tell them. We can tell where, the breaks are, right? So, quote 1. Segregation is not only politically, economically, and sociologically unsound, it is morally wrong and sinful. Paul Tillich has said that sin is separation. Is not segregation an existential expression of man's tragic separation, his awful estrangement, his terrible sinfulness? Thus it is that I can urge men to obey the 1954 decision of the Supreme Court, for it is morally right, and I can urge them to disobey segregation ordinances, for they are morally wrong. 2. Just as Socrates felt that it was necessary to create a tension in the mind, so that individuals could rise from the bondage of myths and half-truths to the unfettered realm of creative analysis and objective appraisal, so must we see the need for nonviolent gadflies to create the kind of tension in society that will help men rise from the dark depths of prejudice and racism to majestic heights of understanding and brotherhood. 3. Over the last few years, I have consistently preached that nonviolence demands that the means we use must be as pure as the ends we seek. So I have tried to make it clear that it is wrong to use immoral means to attain moral ends. But now I must affirm that it is just as wrong, or even more, to use moral means to preserve immoral ends. 4. Society must protect the robbed and punish the robber. 5. Freedom is never voluntarily given by the oppressor. It must be demanded by the oppressed. 6. Shallow understanding from people of goodwill is more frustrating than absolute misunderstanding from people of ill will. Lukewarm acceptance is much more bewildering than outright rejection. 7. A just law is a man-made code that squares with the moral law. 8. So the question is not whether we will be extremists, but what kind of extremists we will be. Will we be extremists for hate or for love? Will we be extremists for the preservation of injustice or for the extension of justice? 9. We must come to see that human progress never rolls in on wheels of inevitability. It comes through the tireless efforts and persistent work of men willing to be co-workers with God, and without this hard work, time itself becomes an ally of the forces of social stagnation. 10. All too many others have been more cautious than courageous, and have remained silent behind the anes, I can't see that word, anesthetizing, like anesthesia, but anesthetizing security of stained glass windows. 11. Let justice roll down like waters, and righteousness like a mighty stream. I believe that's actually a Bible verse. There's a
few in there that I think could have their origin there, but go ahead.
Yeah, sure. I mean, Dr. King was a preacher, so
that's what they say, yeah.
Yeah, so I mean, a lot, talking about, all that quote, all too many others have been more cautious than courageous and have remained silent behind the I can't say it again, anesthetizing security of stained glass windows. It's talking about like the stained glass windows of a church. Mm-hmm. Being silent behind, hiding behind the stained glass windows. All right, so 12. Oppressed people cannot remain oppressed forever. The urge for freedom will eventually come. This is what has happened to the American Negro. Something within has reminded him of his birthright of freedom. Something without has reminded him that he can gain it. 13. Injustice anywhere is a threat to justice everywhere.
That, I think, might be the most famous quote from that whole letter.
Yes.
I think that's the one that is repeated the most often, right?
I think so, yeah.
Yeah.
14. One has not only a legal, but a moral responsibility to obey just laws. Conversely, one has a moral responsibility to disobey unjust laws. 15. Let us all hope that the dark clouds of racial prejudice will soon pass away, and the deep fog of misunderstanding will be lifted from our fear-drenched communities, and in some not-too-distant tomorrow, the radiant stars of love and brotherhood will shine over our great nation with all their scintillating beauty. Hope I said that correctly. 16. The judgment of God is upon the church as never before. If today's church does not recapture the sacrificial spirit of the early church, it will lose its authenticity, forfeit the loyalty of millions, and be dismissed as an irrelevant social club with no meaning for the 20th century. 17. Justice too long delayed is justice denied. 18. I have almost reached the regrettable conclusion that the Negro's great stumbling block in the stride towards freedom is not the white citizen's counselor or the Ku Klux Klanner, but the white moderate who is more devoted to order than to justice. 19. Actually, time is neutral. It can be used either destructively or constructively. I am coming to feel that the people of ill will have used time much more effectively than the people of goodwill. We will have to repent in this generation, not merely for the vilatrolic words and actions of the bad people, but for the appalling silence of the good people. And then 20. Whenever the early Christians entered a town, the people in power became disturbed and immediately sought to convict the Christians for being disturbers of the peace and outside agitators. But the Christians pressed on, in the conviction that they were a colony of heaven, called to obey God rather than man. Small in number, they were big in commitment. They were too God-intoxicated to be astronomically intimidated. By their effort and example, they brought an end to such ancient evils as infanticide and gladiatorial contests. So, those are the 20 quotes.
It's a beautiful letter if you ever get the chance to read it in full.
Oh my gosh, it really is.
I know that you've picked out 20 quotes. I asked you how much you had, and you're like, "Oh, I got 20 quotes," and I was like, "Jesus, 20 quotes!" But I mean, even that only barely scratches the surface of the letter.
Yeah,
it's a really interesting read.
It is. If you have a little more time, I'd like to read the introductory section, because it talks a lot about Birmingham and why Birmingham, why he's there, why.
Well, yeah. I mean, I wonder if maybe I'll post the link to the letter.
You should.
Full text to it, either in the description or somewhere after we're done with this show, so that people, if they want to read it, they can certainly check it out there.
I agree.
Because, like I said, it's kind of impossible for us to break it all down now in the moment, but it's something that I think that people should read when they have a little more time on their hands.
I agree.
And it gives them more of a chance to absorb it and all of that. So, I look into that once we go offline, and I'll add that to the description of this video.
Sure. But do you mind if I read a portion, like a small portion of that introduction?
I mean, if you've got something lined up, yeah.
I do. So yeah, basically, and I'm just reading the second half of it. But I am in Birmingham because injustice is here. Just as the 8th century prophets left their little villages and carried their "Thus saith the Lord" far beyond the boundaries of their hometowns, and just as the Apostle Paul left his little village of Tarsus and carried the gospel of Jesus Christ to practically every hamlet and the city of the Greco-Roman world, I too am compelled to carry the gospel of freedom beyond my particular hometown. Like Paul, I must constantly respond to the Macedonian call for aid. Moreover, I am cognizant of the interrelatedness of all communities and states. I cannot sit idly by in Atlanta and not be concerned about what happens in Birmingham. Injustice anywhere is a threat to justice everywhere. So that's where that line is, in specifically. Yeah. And never again can we afford to live with the narrow, provincial, outside agitator idea. Anyone who lives inside the United States can never be considered an outsider. You deplored the demonstrations that are presently taking place in Birmingham, but I am sorry that your statement did not express a similar concern for the conditions that brought the demonstrations into being. I am sure that each of you would want to go beyond the superficial social analyst who looks merely at effects and does not grapple with underlying causes. I would not hesitate to say that it is unfortunate that so-called demonstrations are taking place in Birmingham at this time, but I would say in more emphatic terms that it is even more unfortunate that the white power structure of the city left the Negro community with no other alternative.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Well, thank you for introducing us to the actual text of the letter.
You're welcome.
And yeah, so we'll post some links later for you guys so that you guys can check it out on your own. Yeah, thank you, Laura. That was great.
You're welcome. Thank you, Dan.
Any closing thoughts before we close up shop here?
I don't have any. Is there anybody in the chat that has any?
I got nothing there, Charlie.
Well, I admit I haven't been fully monitoring the chat, so
I haven't been either. But
I saw Mark tagged me in something. Hopefully, it happens this year, but I don't know what that's in reference to.
I don't know.
I don't know either.
But I guess I would say in closing, I would kind of reiterate what I said at the top, which is that there's a lot to talk about here in this city, and it's kind of unfortunate that it doesn't get more attention than it currently does, and I think part of that is understandable. Because of its location, it gets overshadowed by the Atlantas and the Nashvilles and the Memphises of the world. But yeah, there's a lot of history here, and there's a lot to cover, and I think we hit on pretty much the essential stuff. I mean, I know that we could go on for hours and hours more about some of this stuff, but I think we did a good job in giving everybody a pretty thorough overview of everything that there is to talk about here. What do you think?
I think so, and yes, I now understand what Mark was referencing, because I mentioned last year on the show that, I can't come because of holiday party, and then COVID killed that party and kept it from happening, and then kept the postponed party from happening too.
That's right.
So you never know what could happen next weekend. I do want to clarify one random factoid. We've made the joke all throughout about, is it 2059 or 5920? We never actually stated where that comes from. It's because in 2015 basically the Alabama DOT they were like, we've been calling it 2059, but really it should be 5920 because 59 came first.
Yeah, so let's do the intelligent thing and reverse the numbers, because that won't confuse people.
Not at all.
So you notice how on my PowerPoint there, I went very much out of my way in the on the design of the slides to call it 2059. So that's what I'm calling it, and I will fight you if you disagree with me. So
I agree with you for no other reason than the Move 2059 group, which formed in 2015.
Well, there you go.
Had it in numeric order. Yes.
Yeah, so they had it correct. Yeah, I understand.
Exactly.
That. Yeah. Yep. But yeah, as we take one more spin on the new viaduct here, it's a nice drive actually. It's nice and wide. You couldn't say that about the old highway where I think it was only 3 lanes per direction, and there were no shoulders, and there were left-hand exits and entrances on the viaducts, and it was just a disaster. So they actually built something that's kind of nice. Like I said, it's going to be interesting to see what happens with that urban park underneath the bridge. I'd be very interested to see what that or how it evolves over the years, like when it comes to presentation. And also, I'm curious to see what kind of use it gets.
Yeah.
Because the real estate beneath a freeway overpass can be used in a multitude of different ways. And a lot of them, can be creative, and they can be very useful, in fact. So, this is one of those, urban social experiment type things that bears some watching in the years ahead.
I agree, and I really hope the park gets a lot of use and that it's really cool. And I did find out that you can get day passes for the dog park, so that does lower the barrier of entry a little bit.
Oh,
it's not
okay.
You don't have to have annual membership. So if you're visiting Birmingham with your dog, if you've been inspired after our presentation, you can get a day pass. But still, the fact that it's a membership dog park. I was on a field trip with some planners yesterday, and I mentioned about there being a membership dog park, and they were like, "What?"
Yeah, because nobody does that.
Yeah.
It's just I'm like, what? Anyway.
Yeah.
Well, anyway, I guess we should wrap up shop here, right? So
yeah.
Thank you all very much to everybody who tuned in. I really appreciate you guys watching. Thank you very much to Laura, who did a fantastic job of being my sidekick this evening. Looking forward to having her on more shows this winter, and maybe 1 or 2 other dopes will stop by during this winter to help me out also. That'd be nice. That would be nice. I would like to do these shows with more than one person every once in a while. Not that there's anything wrong with you, because you certainly keep us occupied. But
well, thank you.
It'd be nice to see if we can get some other people into the mix here, which we'll see what we can do starting next week. You've been watching another quality presentation from the Roadway Wiz YouTube channel. We thank you all very much for that. I hope you enjoyed this episode. If you haven't already done so, you can hit the subscribe button. You can give this video a thumbs up. You can also leave a comment explaining how awesome I am. I always love getting those. And we'll look forward to seeing you next time, next Saturday. Same bat time, same bat channel. Until then, happy travels. Enjoy that late autumn, early winter weather in some parts of the country. And be safe out there. We'll see you next time.
See you next time.